Thanks for tuning in to the Medevac podcast, powered by the Robert Irvine Foundation, whose mission is to support and strengthen the physical and mental well-being of our nation's heroes and their families. I'm one of your hosts, David Reid.
And I'm your other host, Christian Meyers. Thank you very much for joining us today on the Medevac podcast. If you're new here, there's a price for the show. You have to share it with a friend or family member if you get something out of today's episode. And I think we're going to get something out of today's episode.
I hope so.
Yeah. Our guest today is Sergio Saenz.
Welcome, Sergio.
Thank y'all so much. Y'all been great hosts so far. I appreciate y'all having me.
Of course. Thanks for being here. Sergio is an Air Force veteran. He spent about 6 years on active duty from 2004 to 2010 as a SATCOM engineer, a private contractor after that, and now he runs a psychedelic integration church. Am I saying that correctly?
That's correct. Yeah, okay. An entheogenic church.
Entheogenic church. Fantastic. Right. Well, yeah, we're excited to hear your story, man.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, of course. No, it's a pleasure to be here again, and I look forward to sharing my story with you guys.
Absolutely. Well, let's rewind it. Before the church was set up, and you're laughing.
Yeah, I know. There's a lot there. a lot is involved with coming to this point in my life. So, how far would y'all like me to go?
Yeah, so I want to rewind it back to kind of what inspired you to join the military. Was it family, friends, sense of service, getting a college education, or just wanting to be a badass?
You know, for me, I had an interesting reason for joining the Air Force. I grew up very privileged. You know, my parents were successful. They had a successful business. And anytime I got in trouble, it was erased, you know, and taken care of for me. So at the point that I graduated from high school, I started recognizing that that's not how the world works outside of the small town that I grew up in. So for me, I joined the Air Force for the opportunity to discover responsibility for myself, you know, to feel what it's like to have to earn, you know, the respect behind my name. And that part of it was appealing for me.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's not very typical for someone who comes from a privileged background, to be honest.
Yeah, and I was one of the first in my family line to join the military too. So you're absolutely right. I didn't have any influence other than, you know, once I mentioned that I was going to be joining the Air Force or the military. Initially, I was looking at the Marines for the same reason, just to be a badass. But my parents, once they realized that I was committed to the decision, decided to put me in touch with a general. And the general was a general of the Army.
Wow.
So he sat me down and he said, look, if you're going to do this, you need to make sure that the job that you select is going to net you income when you leave the service. And if I'm recommending something, it's the Air Force. And I was just like, okay.
Man, if we all had just beautiful mentors like that at the beginning of our service. You know, I walked in and they're like, infantry? I'm like, hell yeah. No trade skills when I get out?
Right. No, of course.
How much fun do I get to have, though? That was the question I had when I walked in. Yeah.
And for me, the appeal was travel, you know, but I ended up just traveling straight up the East Coast from South Texas, you know, like literally in chronological order. You know, I was from deep South Texas, a small town called Fremont, just north of the Rio Grande Valley. And I end up in San Antonio for basic training. I went to Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi for tech school. I went to Georgia for my electronics principles. And then I ended up my first duty station in Florida. So I was like, man, I can't leave the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, exactly.
So in Florida, what was your day-to-day in the Air Force?
So I was in Florida briefly for about 1.5 years. And at that point, it was my first duty station. So I was learning how to operate all of the equipment that I was working with Track 170s, very large aperture, direct and tropospheric satellite systems, as well as different types of networking, you know, like working on routers, working on switches, and learning the ins and outs and preparing myself for deployment. Okay. So there was a lot of just qualifying, you know, in the first year. We had this book that we had to log all the things that we learned in, you know, and just kind of incrementally get more familiar with the equipment that we would be operating with in theater, you know. So that was the day to day, and then we did a lot of exercises, you know, like where we did mock deployments and things like that. just in preparation. But a majority of my time in the Air Force was in Georgia at Robins Air Force Base, and that was a combat communications squadron, so or a combat communications group altogether. And there it was exercise after exercise, making sure that we were proficient and preparing for deployments. There were 4 squadrons, and each squadron would deploy a quarter, so it was a really regular deployment schedule. And we would deploy in support of people like you, all of the communications that were necessary outside of the wire. We were part of maintaining and repairing.
So all the the red lines and green lines in every military installation, are you like participating in that and getting that all set up?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Interesting. So the week-long deployments and mock deployments, those exercises, absolutely. And we would work with all parts of the Air Force too. So like supply, logistics were there. All the high-speed people would show up in the last day and just kind of say like, yeah, I could work here. This would be acceptable, and then leave. Because they had much more detailed exercise, operations. But nonetheless, it was heavily involved with all of the people, like the workings, the inner workings of what would have accompanied us in theater.
Okay. So now the difference between a regular comm squadron and a combat comm squadron, you guys actually go outside the wire during deployments. Right,
exactly. Yeah, and that's essentially what got me in trouble upstairs. It's like I was we pretended a lot to be ready for combat.
Sure.
In my opinion, really, because some people handled it better than I did. But nonetheless, once I went on my first deployment, it was in Bagram Air Force Base, or Bagram Airfield, in Afghanistan. As soon as I left the wire, I realized how ill prepared I was for the situation. Like we had a mobility training for that, like maybe 10 days long, where we pretend to be out, and it's like austere conditions. Sure. And we're getting attacked with miles gear and things like that, but that was it. And after that, there was no more pretending to be at battle. So once you start hearing, gunfire and mortars and even like, F-15s whizzing by, it changes things, it brings you into reality very quickly. And for me, there was a lot of pretending to be cool in those situations too, like just being out there, knowing, when any time that I had to leave the wire, or like Bagram, it was to a cop or a fob to repair equipment that was either, user error, it wasn't working, or a mortar hit it, so like you never know. You just know that the comms are down, and you have kind of an idea because there's a technician there. But my job was to go in, assess the damage, figure out what was salvageable, what we could do to maintain communications, and then come back, get the parts, and then make the repair, later on whenever a bird could take us back, Okay. But my first ever, I remember it was I think it was called Bullard, if I'm not mistaken. But there was no lights there, and I got there at night, so I was working with a red headlamp, and just thinking like, man, they were shooting here earlier, and I'm walking around outside on top of buildings because there were antennas,
Okay.
Like with a red light on my head. I was like, if I needed a target, that's a pretty decent target. And I understand, that why we use red lights and things like that, but it doesn't make you more comfortable. It was pitch black. And like if you opened a door, it illuminated the entire, area because, the lights were on inside. But, so it was a really, really interesting exercise mentally for me to go through, just like, you thought you were ready,
people take that for granted so often, just being able to walk to their trash can at night. In Afghanistan or Iraq, you can't do that. It's everything's a threat, right? So that's pretty interesting, especially like given your family background. How was that for you, kind of transitioning into that military service where, it might have been very cush in the beginning, but then you get thrown into this brand new world where you're expected to report to authority now, which you probably,
it was
didn't
different.
respond to the best in the beginning, right?
For sure. Yeah. And I have a funny story to share about that. But interestingly enough, I also grew up on a cattle ranch. So I wasn't foreign to, like,
Getting your
anytime
hands
I got
dirty.
in trouble in high school, I either had to go and work in my parents' insurance agency filing things or fix a fence.
Okay.
Like, or go and work cattle for a day or whatever the case was. So I was not foreign to that part of it, especially the being screamed at, like, because working cattle is high stress,
Oh yeah.
like, so and you can get hurt really quickly. These are huge animals, so there's all of us are screaming at each other just to make sure that we all get to have lunch together,
Sure.
So yeah, that part of it wasn't the issue for me. The not having a name behind who I was the issue. Not being a recognizable, respected person was the issue. And I remember the first day that I showed up to basic training. At that time in my life, I was like a skater, so I had ripped jeans and, it's specifically the back
Just an
pocket.
attitude that comes with it.
Exactly. Yeah. So just a knuckle sandwich delivering kind of guy, But so I show up and we head to the DFAC and everyone's screaming at me at the same time. And I just kind of like held my bearing, I was being screamed at, so there's not much you can do. But then they started like with the shoving and stuff, and I was just like, chill out. And I told him to chill out, and he was like, oh, you think you're badass, like, like, this is my house, you're not gonna last a week. And then in that moment, I just remember him grabbing my back pocket and ripping the right leg off of my jeans. So I was wearing my right pant leg as a sock, like for the rest of the time, and they wouldn't let me fix it. It was the first day of basic training. So you had 3 seconds to eat the plate.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone has to stand up. You had to throw away all the delicious food, and it was just this really high stress thing. But that was the key moment where I was like, man, you're not shit in this moment. This is you. The clean slate you wanted is right here delivered for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you found it, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny they keep you looking like kind of a bag of ass walking around your first couple of days,
Sure.
ripping your pant leg.
And it was a couple days because they didn't give us our uniforms until the third day.
Yeah, until day 3 or 4.
That was it, man.
Yeah.
I was just walking around with a cold right leg.
It sounds like you got what you're looking for, though. You're like, hey, I'm open to a new situation. Please change my perspective, my point of view, and you got what you asked for. It sounds like,
of course. Yeah. And then from that point, it became just proving that guy wrong. He thought I was going to break, and he found almost the point of which I would have, but. Then it was just, I'm going to prove that guy wrong, like that drill sergeant.
Isn't it so insightful though when you get to the age where you realize that he did that on purpose? Yeah. Like, you're like, I'm going to get him back. And he's like, yeah, get me back. Like, that's what he wanted. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
And you're like, damn it. Now I'm not going to do anything.
No, it's a hell of a motivator.
It is.
Absolutely.
And I mean, they have been doing it for quite some time. It's just like breaking us down, And so that's pretty interesting. So during your career, you're getting this eye-opening experience overseas. You feel the self-development happening, obviously. Any sort of situations happen, outside the wire where you were just like, maybe this is not what I signed up for, or?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I remember, one thing to key into about my military experience is that I had an M9. I was deployed with an M9, and my M16 was in a locker always.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, because I worked with my hands, and I worked. My job was expedited. So I was only expected to be there for short periods of time.
Sure.
So it was almost like a ComSec situation. Like where if they got to me, it was to basically defend our security keys and things like that. So I specifically remember one time that the fob was being attacked, and the guy next to me said, I'm going to take a higher vantage point. So if you see me start rolling down the hill, you need to come and grab my saw and defend the area. And I was just like,
Oh, Jesus.
I don't even know how to use it. You know, like what's going on here, you know? But in that moment, I remember just like pressing my back so hard up against the bunker, you know, just thinking like, you have to do this, you know, like this is what you signed up for. So there was this internal battle, you know, in my head. There was also a point where, like, you know, when we were working on line of sight, you had to climb up a tower, and that's something that shoots directly across, like a flight line or to a base. So in that moment, I remember hearing like bullets whizzing by, and just thinking like, what is a dragonfly doing up here? You know, like in my head, I was just my initial thought was, surely I'm not being shot at. You know, and then I heard a tink on the metal, and I remember just sliding down with my hands and my feet, you know, just all the way down this little tower, and just like almost having a heart attack, just in that moment of realization that, you know, it was that close to making impact. It was a really, really interesting moment for me. Yep.
Was that in Bagram?
That was in Kandahar.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
Sounds like
Back in what year was this?
That would have been Kandahar in 2009.
Yeah. Well, which was a pretty hot area at the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
it was really hot then. Yeah.
But the NATO base was great.
Yeah.
And you were there probably, I mean, that was probably a year before they put the chilies in.
Yeah.
3 years before.
Well, and I got to go back when I was a contractor.
Yeah.
You know, I was in Salerno, which is eastern Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Now that's a cush place.
And you went in Salerno. So you went back in 2000.
In 2010. Like, so I actually had a conversation about getting hired while I was there active duty, you know, and I was working alongside another civilian, and he said, like, at that point I decided that I was leaving the Air Force. You know, I had gone through a DUI situation, you know, when I got back from my deployment. You know, I was leaning heavily on alcohol to cope with PTSD.
Sure.
And I ended up, after like a sports day, I was an athlete, you know, from a small town. If you're good at one thing, you have to be good at everything, you know? So, so I ended up, you know, performing really well on the sports day. And my first sergeant invited me out for a beer, and I said, man, I'm exhausted. You know, I'll go and I'll have one beer and I'll leave, you know? And that's exactly what I did for the first time ever. You know, like I was an alcoholic, don't get me wrong, but in this instant, I show up, you know, I say hi to everybody. He ordered me a pint. I drank the pint and I said, I got to go, you know, and I lived like maybe 5 minutes away from the bar that we were at. So when I left, I got pulled over, and because it was so fresh in my mouth, I took the breathalyzer thinking I only had one beer. I'm exhausted. Let's get this over with.
Yeah.
And I got hung out to dry, man. So I ended up having to deploy again. Like once I went to court, the judge let me know, like old school style, you know, and this is in Georgia. That's probably why, you know, I wasn't expecting this to be the case, but nonetheless, he said, we'll wipe this off your record if you hop on the next deployment, you know, so.
Interesting.
Like, yeah. So,
but that's good. I mean, Georgia's a military state, and they you know, obviously home of the infantry, and these guys just ruin it for everybody. Let's be honest. The trainees ruin it for everybody.
Make a lot of bad choices.
Yeah. So they just like, they could smell a DUI just coming out of the bar.
Yeah. No, and it was that whole story it's interesting too, because even the cop that had pulled me over was kicked out of the Air Force. He was an MP that didn't cut it, you know, and like, so he had this angst against the Air Force anyways, you know, and I remember the entire ride back thinking, I can't wait for my attorney to hear this recording, because it's obvious to me that this guy has like a personal vendetta against the Air Force, right?
He's taking it out on you.
Yeah. And that's not the case. Like they had all that, and they were just like, you know what, man, like
it's the same team. Yeah. That's something I don't get, you know, is we should, you know, I'm here to support blue if you let me, you know, but you make it so difficult sometimes.
Yeah, no, they do in situations like that. And if you can't hack it as a cop in the Air Force,
right?
It probably says something about the person you were pulled over by.
Yeah, exactly.
Being a current police officer. But it sounds like you got out. I mean, it sounds like you were struggling with some mental health issues at the time. So I wonder, do you see it in a positive light that you got deployment as an option instead of going to jail? Because going to jail, that's going to ruin a big part of your life. You're going to have a felony. But
post-traumatic stress would definitely get worse in that situation.
In jail, but it's also going to get worse on another deployment too. So like weighing your options there,
or at least mask it. I think
that too.
Yeah, for sure. No, and I'm absolutely at a point in my life where I recognize everything that has happened to me in the past has happened so perfectly to get me to where I am today. You know, without those conditions being met, then I wouldn't be involved with Agape Church. You know, I wouldn't have had the need to discover the healing properties or the spiritual properties of plant medicines. You know, had everything gone well, I'd probably still be in the Air Force.
Sure.
You know, and that was the track that I was on while I was active duty. I was high speed, you know, for my career. And it's not normal for an enlisted person to be an engineer for satellite communications. It's usually an officer's duty, but I was elevated after my DUI. They dug into my record and they were like, dude, this guy knows what he's doing. We're going to, as punishment, we're bringing you to the engineering office. And I was just like, that sounds cool. You know, like, I don't have to set up stuff anymore. I'm just doing the planning, you know, and the logistics. And that's actually what allowed me to explore the civilian sector, you know, so it was a blessing in disguise. And it sucked because by the same token, the Air Force had just kicked off That Guy program, for DUIs and DWIs. So the first time they came to Robbins Air Force Base, I knew all the answers because I had just been through a DUI. And the guy was like, "Why do you know so much about DUIs?" I was like, "Because I'm that guy." You know, I just got one. You know?
That guy campaign.
Yeah,
I remember that.
Yeah, it was, don't be that guy.
Don't be
that guy.
Here I am. You know, like
it's a good campaign. It probably cost $1 billion.
Yeah, exactly, dude.
So you're doing logistics and planning for combat comms as well now.
Right, exactly.
So now you're on the logistics side of everything.
Right. Yeah, and partly because when I got in trouble and had to deploy again, it wasn't with my own unit. It was with a sister company. You know, like so it ended up the next available deployment I had to hop on. So that was interesting, and I ended up fulfilling an E6 role, you know, as an E4, like to kind of comply with this request, and that ended up really like giving me the leadership potential that was available in that moment, you know, like it was supposed to be a failure. They were trying to get rid of me by setting me up for a failure, you know, in that way.
And you rose to the challenge.
I rose to the challenge. Yeah. So I end up, and it annoyed the colonel that I deploy with so much. He thought I was a dirtbag, you know, like he absolutely did. So he was just like, "I'm going to make your life hell the entire time." And then I kept getting called to command for awards and recognition for the job I was doing. And he was like, "Well, you can't go without me," you know, and like make sure to say that you're with me. And like, it was like, what?
Yeah, terrible
leading to the point,
leadership quality.
Even worse, man. Like, because I fulfilled an E6 role, I put myself in for an E6 award. And he stripped my bullet points off of my award submission. And he said, "Well, these are going on my award, so you need to figure out what you're going to put in the place of these." He was like, "And I'm never going to give an E4 an award that an E6 deserves." And I was like, "Well, you didn't have any issue with me doing the job of the E6. Like, what is the problem, you know?" Like, so yeah, that guy, I would love to have a conversation with that guy just to figure out where his head was in that instance, and what the lesson that he was trying to instill in me was. You know, because for me, it doesn't make any sense to take that approach.
Unfortunately, a lot of people, you know, their objective is not to give a lesson. It's self-absorbed and to take care of themselves. It sounds to me like you drafted the bullets and he stole them and said, "Come up with new ones."
Yeah.
That is not leadership in any capacity.
That, or he had a lot of preconceived notions about who he thought you were, right?
Right. Yeah.
Here's this guy coming from another unit, got a DUI. He's getting sent to me, so they're probably sending me the shitbag airman, right?
Right.
But it could be the train of thought, then he never got an opportunity, or he never took the time to get to know who you are.
Right, of course. Right? Yeah, and that's what I suspect, you know. And even after we had to work very closely with each other too, because I was in every planning meeting with him, you know. So I feel like there was that time afforded, but the guard never dropped with him, and of course, he's at the time a lieutenant colonel, that was up for a promotion.
Okay.
So I think more so than anything, similar to the drill sergeant, like he knew and it was the fuel that was building the fire in my performance, like I'm not the person that throws his hands up because someone doesn't believe in me. My character is to rise to the occasion and show you that I am capable of whatever it is that you expect of me.
Sure. So talk about your transition out of the military and into your civilian job. So you became a contractor shortly after. You said you were afforded some opportunities to be exposed to that on your last deployment. So
right.
What was the transition like out for you? Do you have any struggles there? And
it was seamless, okay. and because I came home to out process and I went straight back to Afghanistan. So there was like maybe a 3-month window where I had to go into the telecommunication systems was the name of the company at the time. They're no longer. I don't think that they're still in operation, but they had a training process for me to go through on a specific terminal that was foreign to us. The Army had just bought this terminal. It was a flyaway terminal, very portable. That had the capabilities of sustaining a COP or a FOB. So I had to learn this new system and learn it in and out, because my job as in the civilian sector was to make it work no matter what, Okay. So there are some really interesting stories about some of the tactics. I used a piece of gum wrapper because I didn't have solder to sustain communications long enough to let people know that we needed solder. So it was like it didn't last very long, but I got the transmission out.
Yeah.
But really interesting, creative. I absolutely loved that role, because it was me and the equipment kind of talking to each other and figuring out, how to keep the conversation going for the people that needed communications.
Sure.
So that transition was very fast and very seamless, and I found myself flying to Afghanistan, and taking a different course. Like we ended up stopping in oh my God, what is the name of it? I'm at a loss. Not Abu Dhabi.
Qatar?
No,
Kuwait?
It's like one of the richest cities in the world.
Dubai?
Oh yeah. So the first trip I went to Dubai was as a civilian, and they put me up in this massive hotel room that looked like an apartment. I was just blown away, and thinking in my head man, I wish that Lieutenant Colonel could see where I'm at now. Screw the bullet point,
right?
Yeah, just kind of
30th floor view.
Exactly. Yeah. So it was interesting, that part of it for me was very rewarding, to at least feel like a value to the job that I was performing. It's hard to get that in the military, because it's always a beat you down situation. Even when you're high speed or a good old boy, it's but you're still an E6 or an E4. There's always that check and balance, if you will, of hierarchy. So yeah, it was nice. And then the biggest thing for me in the civilian sector that was impactful is no weapon. I could have a knife with less than a 6-inch blade, and that's it. So no pistol, no rifle, no anything, just my own hands to defend myself and something to poke somebody with, and that's it. So it was learning to put a lot of faith in the people around me. And I found myself in a very similar situation where I was at a COP, and it was they flew me in, and I don't know why you would tell somebody this, but they're like, look, it's supposed to get overrun. Send an email to your family and let them know that this COP may be overrun, but the communications is a key. So you have to go out and fix this snap terminal. I was like, oh my God, okay.
I'll just put my knife in my mouth and run off and
Rambo it.
And even worse, the flight pattern, the helicopter wasn't returning for 8 days. Like, so no matter what, I was there for 8 days. So I was there. It took me an hour and a half to fix the terminal. I was like, are you sure you can't just come back? You know, like I know
just
you
like,
went
how about wait?
Yeah. I just was paying so much attention to like my availability of leaving that situation, you know? Like, so I remember finding like the corner of the base and just saying, this is where I'm going to sleep. You know, I don't need anything. You just sleep. I'm here. If anything happens to the terminal, let me know. And I remember trying to sleep for 8 days, you know, like my job was done, you know? And then it got to a point where like, you know, one of the people had a guitar there. So one of the nights I came out and I started getting to know people, and that for me was eye-opening. And it kind of instilled the understanding that there was an observer role that I was supposed to be in those moments too, you know, to better understand what these, you know, infantry people were going through. Yeah. So I took it as an opportunity to get to know like what it is they were being exposed to, how that was affecting them, what their stories were, and kind of held that in my heart for the rest of the time, you know, and that became my motivation to get the job done. Yeah. You know, so rather than like, you know, fixating on my own, you know, well-being, it became like this family mentality for me for the first time ever. You know, in that situation, I was just like, you know, I'm not the only human being that's here right now, you know, and there's a lot to learn for, especially in the conditionings of the mind on how to cope with these things, because I was only there for 8 days, but those guys, they were fulfilling their 1 year in that copper fob. Yeah. You know, so it was like, get over yourself, man. You know, like if they're going to get overrun, it's because it's what they built that is going to be overrun, you know? So imagine, you know, the hardships of that. And like, that's a lot of weight to bear. Yeah. That, and it sounds like you've found that the moment you stopped focusing on yourself and you started focusing on other people, it made it a little bit easier for you. Because you're focused on your own well-being and, man, like I'm at this fob, like this sucks. And then you look at these guys sitting right next to you, like, well, like it's been sucking for them a lot longer, a lot harder. Like I really don't have it that bad at the end of the day. No, exactly. No, and it comes to a realization that everybody smells like baby wipes. You know? Yeah, exactly. Like everyone's here sucking at the same time. Yeah, exactly.
Isn't that something that you didn't really experience in your time in?
Not to that extent, like because the real missing factor was that I was a asset, you know, like I 100% was an asset, so I didn't have a weapon. So what really changed, even with an M9, you know, I always say if it ever got to a point of me using the M9, I probably would have given it to them, you know, like, hey, like here you go, I don't want any trouble, you know, like that's the honest to God truth, because that means a lot of other heavier, you know, weaponry didn't stop the enemy, you know, like, so let's get real, you know, in that moment, I probably would have been a captive, you know, so in either case, you know, not having anything at all to defend yourself with other than the people that are around you is faith-based, you know, like that's nothing but faith. You're believing that the training of a complete stranger is enough to save your life. You know, and for me, that was the big difference between, you know, going from the active duty, you know, exposure, because it was the same areas. I had already been there. Some of the same people were still there, you know, when I came as a civilian. So that part of it wasn't foreign to me. Okay. What was foreign is not having any means of defending myself other than the people around me. Yeah.
Now, how long did you do as a civilian in Afghanistan?
I was there for a year and 2 months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and at Salerno. Okay. Like, and all of Eastern Afghanistan is what I managed. So it was like 130 terminals. Like, so I kind of just flew around on a helicopter the entire time. And I worked directly with the Rakkasans while I was there. So so they're an active group, you know, and they kept me busy. Yeah. So it was really interesting.
So a year was all you wanted to do?
Yeah, and you know, being a satellite communication, being involved in communications, it gives you one of the biggest privileges in theater and in being able to communicate with your family. So at that time, I had my son was about 2 years old. And every single night I was able to Skype with him, you know, so we had video calls together, and it got to a point close to the end of my deployment where I received a picture and an email, and it was of my son hugging a laptop, like calling the laptop daddy. And I was like, man, my son is associating our relationship with a device, like, so I started exploring. This was probably like 2 months before the end of my term, and I was already getting offers and like, if you want to stay, this is what we're willing to give you situations. So I had, a really hard decision in front of me, and I decided, to leave satellite communications altogether. Because the necessity for satellite communications is only in austere conditions where there aren't other means of communications available, which means there's no civilian, like civilization, that is nearby. So I had to put the last, 7 years aside, like of all of my training and stuff. And I came back to my family-owned business, At that time, my parents had grown their agency out of the small town into the Rio Grande Valley, and they opened their second location. So they needed help, and at that time it started with building a website, So I was like, well, let me build the website, and in the time that it takes me to get my insurance license, I'll already have the website done.
Okay.
Well, I had a lot of time in Afghanistan towards the end, so it started getting really quiet. I built the website in like a month. And then I started studying for the license when I got back. I took the test and I passed it on my first attempt and started selling insurance for them. So I ended up doing that until 2019.
How'd you fare in the sales world?
Oh, it was excellent.
Yeah, I bet.
It was really, really interesting too, because, I look back at how torturous it was to be going through PTSD, putting a face like, in front of people
the mask.
all day, like you have your life together, and then drowning yourself in alcohol. That's literally what my day looked like, show up to work.
In 2019?
This was from 2011 to 2019. So almost 8 years I was a licensed insurance agent.
No, I mean your PTS and your alcoholism, is that tied in to this new position with your family-owned business?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There was, it started while
So we haven't addressed any of the issues at this point.
Right,
We've
exactly.
gotten through 7 years, and all of a sudden it's probably like it's time.
For sure. No, and I remember my first episode with PTS was while I was in Georgia. I had just gotten back from my first deployment, and I think the noise that I heard, like looking back at the scenario, was a car backfiring.
Okay.
But I 100% believed that my house was being attacked. So I was crawling on the ground on all fours. My wife at the time was telling me like that what I was hearing and what I was seeing was not real. So I was like, just go wait in the bedroom, let me make sure everything is okay. And I called the cops and I told them that somebody was shooting in the neighborhood, so I finally believed that it wasn't happening directly to me, but I was assured that there was gunfire, and I continued to hear it, like, and my wife at the time didn't, so there was that moment when it passed, after like probably 2 hours of me crawling around, and like the cops come, I talked to the cops about it, I give a report. And when they left, I remember just thinking how ridiculous it was. It was like, you're in middle Georgia, like the sound that it made, like it would have been like a artillery round.
Yeah.
Like, and that's not at all available to regular criminals, like, come on, what is this about, So I chose to ignore it, though. I thought it was a one-time thing, and really to that extent it was. I think at that point, because I had just gotten back from my deployment, I was still kind of trying to find my baseline. But it was very much the eye-opener for me, and I remember having the conversations with my peers, and everyone just kind of was like, just have another beer, like just drown yourself in it, like, because, and I remember the threat being, if you look for help, you can't deploy.
Exactly.
And there was nothing more shameful for me than that, like not being able to perform my duty, especially, I'm not infantry, so I shouldn't, like, in my head, I kept suggesting to myself that what I was feeling wasn't real because I wasn't in the front lines, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was,
So interestingly enough, we find that infantry instills a certain resilience. It instills an expectation of what you're going to go into. So a lot of like non-combat arms, they're like, I'm just going to be working on satellite communications. Like nothing's going to happen. So you don't have that expectation, that wall to be built up, that protection. So a lot of times you get exposed to it without even being recognized.
Yeah.
right.
So it's interesting to see the kind of differences between that.
It's the same thing.
absolutely.
We talk about this quite often. It's like a military member versus a civilian in a car accident, right? Civilian with a car accident, more often than not, will have more severe PTSD than a military member if they're like an infantry person or a special operator who's prepped and they've been prepared for it. They've been expecting it. Then they go do it. They come back. It's over. As a civilian in a car accident, you're just going to work on the way in the morning, and boom, you have this horrible thing that happens that changes your life. You have no expectation for it. And people in like non-combat arms positions like that, like Dave said, you're not necessarily expecting it. So you've not been able to prepare yourself in the appropriate ways. You've not been able to put those walls up and pre-compartmentalize. And the people that you have to talk to, your supervisors and everything, they probably also don't have very much experience with proper compartmentalization, how to make it through these things, who to talk to appropriately. So there's a lot that I think there's a disservice to like combat arms support roles, specifically like yours, right?
Right.
A lot of guys that go outside the wire and experience a lot of things that they weren't ready for. I think the military can do a much better job of prepping than just the mock deployments where put your gas mask on. Like it doesn't do anything for you.
Right,
It's the same exact thing with sexual trauma victims as
Yes.
well
Yeah.
within the military is, their NCO, he comes onto them or whatever the case may be, they don't expect that from their own team. And that hurts even more and it deeply scars you. So I think that is completely right. What Christian said is it's a disservice and we need to be mentally preparing all of those who go into the service, regardless of what their skill set is, on the mental health capacities of what you could expect to face.
Yeah. I think the Marines do a good job of that because every Marine's a rifleman, right? And every Marine will tell you that.
Well, yeah.
Every Marine will tell you
and they're instilled kill.
Yeah.
So they know what to expect at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Right, of
So
course.
absolutely interesting concept to really like bring to light to our audience, I think.
No, of course. Yeah. And I remember it, interestingly enough, when I was having the conversation around my disability qualifications, for one, I masked it so well that they were about to say that there was nothing wrong with me. And in that moment, I broke down and started crying. And the psychologist was like, what's with you, man? Like what happened?
Yeah.
And I was like, I have to tell you the reason I started this process because I know something's wrong with me. And as soon as I stepped into your office, I just wanted to convince you that I was a good guy.
Yeah.
Like, so I haven't been honest, And he was like, well, you want to start over? And I was like, absolutely. And he's like, well, what is the impact? We go through the initial checklist, like how much are you drinking? How much sleep are you losing? And things like that. I answered truthfully. And he was like, man, you're a completely different person at this point.
Yeah.
We have to start completely over. And he was like, I can't believe that you were like, you just kept composed the way that you did. I was like, I've been doing it for, 12 years.
Yeah.
I've been hiding this for 12. I've become a master at acting like nothing is wrong with me. I was like, if you want to know the truth, feel my pulse. And he grabbed my wrist and he was like, my heart was racing. But then on the exterior, I looked like absolutely a cucumber, just chill. Yeah. So it was interesting to go through that process of again, recognizing that I was in my own way, in this process, like just kind of inflicting my own wounds, asking for help and then saying I'm good, like was not it was a recipe for disaster. So it brought a lot of clarity to the severity of the situation too, like where I was living two lives and I had to change. I had to do something about it, so that was a really interesting part of my process too, that I think a lot of people go through. Another thing was bringing into the realization that, I also had to feed, I had to feed video to fighter pilots. Like, so if they dropped a missile, they needed to confirm the kill. And in that moment, I had to watch the monitors so that we can make sure that the feed didn't drop, like to sustain communications. Like, so I saw a lot of human beings turn white hot, on monitors. And people don't realize what that does to you, because again, coming back to infantry, you expect the PTSD to be coming from direct contact with people. But for me, watching somebody scale a mountain because they hear a jet coming, tripping, falling, and then all of a sudden you see a boom and then they confirm the kill because there's a warm spot on the side of a mountain, not a human being, is just as impactful,
Yeah,
it is. A lot of the drone pilots and drone operators
out of New Mexico.
New Mexico, and then
go home to their family barbecues after doing that, And
every single day. You spend
Can you imagine that?
5 days a week, and they're not to. This is a published number, but 90% of drone strikes are on the incorrect target.
Right,
published number. So, like, to look back on it, to deal with it while it's happening, and then after 10 years pass or 12 years pass, however long you're doing something like that, look back on it and to have these numbers come out, like, it's got to be really hard to process things like that. And we've all seen the drone feed and pred feed and the talk.
And collateral damage. So even 10% of those targets have collateral damage as well to it. So it's hard to see.
Absolutely.
And especially like when you're not reinforced to believe it, right? When we watch, it's very interesting because the same kind of concept happens on Call of Duty, right? We don't have that feeling and that association, but when you feel it on the other end and you see that perspective, something much like what you saw when you talked to those infantries when you sat for 8 days with them, is you understand that there's a face behind it. So I feel like people that have that kind of self-awareness have an even more predispositioned, like, personality trait of being hit a little harder by that. Right.
Yeah. And another interesting observation that I had in those conversations is watching the emotions surface and then get completely battered down to battle hardened, infantrymen. You start getting personal with these people. They start telling you how much they're worried about their family, and then all of a sudden they smother it with, like, hyper masculinity, basically.
Exactly.
And just like, well, whatever, I'll just do push-ups and, or something like
Change
that.
my socks.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Drink some water.
So it was interesting to see, like, the humanity fight for itself, for just a moment, enough for you to recognize it, and then just completely get, shut down.
There's a psychological explanation, though, right? I mean, it is a benefit to, one, indoctrinate your military members into having pride in the military unit that they're within.
It's a cult.
It's a cult. It is.
It is a cult. It's the most successful cult.
Yeah. If you instill a warrior ethos and a warrior mindset, like, hey, you should be cheering every time you get a kill, and implant that, and then back it up, reinforce it. And now what have you done? You've made it safer for them to go and expose themselves to this a little bit longer, right? They're excited that they get to do this, and it makes them a much more deadly soldier. It makes them a much more efficient soldier, and it's going to increase that longevity a little bit. It's the back end that we still haven't seen.
Yeah, and then reintegrating them back into society and saying, oh, that's not good anymore. Yeah. Like, we taught you how to take lives, but now you have to blend back in. And that's the problem, right? The 2-week transitionary period that you took to get out of the military. So we're seeing this, like, quite often, right? Every guest that we talk to.
Right. No, it's sad. It's sad that's collateral damage of performing your duty,
Yeah.
Like, absolutely. But, and then really to tie this into my role now, like what concerns me about the successes that scientists are finding in the effectiveness of using our sacraments like ayahuasca and psilocybin, Bufo alvarius, and San Pedro as effective means of overcoming post-traumatic stress disorder. We're also seeing the military see this as an opportunity to send people back into battle. So the reason that the military is looking into things like ketamine and MDMA is because they believe that they can, one, save a lot of money on disability payments. Like if they can, that's one concerning thing about psilocybin that I've read in articles, is they're poising it as psilocybin cures PTSD. So if they're curing PTSD, and I say PTSD because that's how they're referring to it. I refer to it as PTS, but if you look for the article, it'll be a PTSD article. So in those moments, what they're actually saying is, everybody line up for this wonder drug so that we can strike PTS off of your disability.
Absolutely.
And it's being masked as a good deed.
And this is just big pharma as well, that I'm sure you're seeing starting to take advantage. Now, these pharmaceutical companies are funding the research behind this now, because they're going to go ahead and refurbish and reformat how this looks.
No, exactly.
For this kind of thing.
And for me, that's exactly why the focus is on the pharmaceutical and psychedelics, which are MDMA and ketamine.
Yeah.
And then even psilocybin, being reduced down to psilocin is what they're studying. The chemical, what they can reproduce in a laboratory is what interests them, which is only being driven by big pharma.
And that takes away from the holistic properties as well of this plant-based medicines.
No, exactly. And there's a lot that's the single alkaloid that causes the psychedelic experience in all of the plants that it was stripped from, right?
The psilocin.
Yeah, the psilocin. So what ends up happening is all the other comparable, or not comparable, but complementary alkaloids that are present in this natural plant are not being afforded to the person who is receiving it.
Yeah.
So we're
It's
saying
like sucking
this
out
has
all
to
the
be
nutrients.
Exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. It's like, instead of putting milk in your cereal, you put calcium in your cereal.
Yeah, exactly.
Who's going to eat that bowl of cereal, and get the same results? It's not possible. So that for us is concerning. Especially because we have a direct spiritual relationship with these plants that we work with. So seeing even the setting reduced down to a conversation that's being had with you in the middle of your experience, for me is a disjustice or injustice too. This is an exploratory effort of the spiritual being. So who am I to try to guess what it is that you're going through? Yeah. I can't have an inkling of an idea. And that has become incredibly clear for me in working with veterans, because most veterans come to plant medicines because of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
But when they come to plant medicines, the initial conversation is always like, I don't want to relive what it is that I experienced. I was like, man, a majority of people won't until they're ready to. What you're going to expect is everything that led up to you signing your life away to begin with. A majority of the people that join the military have gone through very specific traumas in their childhood, that led them to make that decision for them. And this is all documented. It's researchable. So it's important for people to understand that you're basically going to be able to look at why you weren't able to compartmentalize these situations in your life and why they are so impactful for you. And it's likely because you weren't actually ready to be in the military. You were suffering from childhood trauma. You were suffering from a broken household. Things like that are what instill those behaviors where you're like, wait a second, this is not what I expected, and this is that ends up being what affects your life so heavily.
Yeah. Well, not to continue diving too far into the psychedelics portion, because I know we're going to talk about that when we talk about the church and everything. But what led you to seeking psychedelics? So obviously you were dealing with your PTSD and alcoholism. Something pushed you that direction.
Yeah, of course. And it was the spiraling out of control, because what I ended up doing, I started to recognize my PTSD needing help around 2012. And that's when I started working with the VA. So I was on pharmaceuticals from 2012 to 2019, on 11 different prescriptions, and trying to take the route that they were suggesting to overcome. And It was very, very effective. Like I remember my life being more manageable for a short period of that time.
Yeah.
And
still 9 years.
Exactly.
11 prescriptions.
Right. Yeah. And so it became me being stripped of my personality, me being stripped of my character, and me just being a busy bee, like being able to perform my day-to-day tasks without a face, without any emotion. So it was a really interesting, observation period for me, because once I started noticing that, excuse me, that I didn't have a personality anymore, I started reaching for it with alcohol and drugs, and that was the only time that I could feel something again. So I was drinking, abusively, to my body and heavily. Like it was normal for me to go through a bottle of liquor in a day, so it was being chased with recreational drug use, and all of it seemed to come to a crash, in a single period in my life, where thankfully I didn't hurt anybody. Thankfully I didn't hurt myself. I found myself in the situation where I was treating, some mortgage brokers, and like I was an insurance agent. So I did, referral sourcing and things like that. And we took people out for drinks all the time, So we stayed out till like 4 a.m. this particular evening. Wow. And my son had an award ceremony the next morning. Right. So when I got home, I thought it was a brilliant idea to keep drinking and using drugs so that I could stay awake rather than pass out and oversleep. Right. So I attempted to do that and probably got pretty close to doing that, but I passed out, on the couch, and I woke up at like 3 p.m. and my son was sitting down right next to me watching cartoons. And as soon as I woke up, he was like, "Oh, good. Now we can go to the award ceremony." And I looked at my clock, and it was 3 o'clock, and we were supposed to be there at 9 a.m. And it was like my heart broke in half, man. That's when I decided, like, this is not working for me. I need to find something else, Good. So I started looking at, first my initial medicine became cannabis, I started using cannabis for a very short period because it wasn't effective at all for me, but I gave it a chance. When you start doing your research, it is highly recommended for PTSD to smoke cannabis,
Yeah.
So, and it was available to me at the time. So I was like, let me give this a shot. And then that research got, snowballed into other, even like at some point I got lost in Ancient Aliens, like it was just kind of one of those rabbit holes that you find yourself like on a Joe Rogan podcast or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, so it was very interesting, but nonetheless, in one of those Ancient Alien conversations, somebody talked about being able to see aliens with ayahuasca in the comments, and I was like, "What is ayahuasca? That sounds awesome!" So I started
elves.
I started doing the research, and there's a bunch of research tied to ayahuasca being effective for post-traumatic stress and hypervigilance, social anxiety, all of it. So I was like, "This is me, man. This is hope." So in that moment, I started looking at going to Peru, and I was dead set on it, like I started planning my trip. And then in that research, I found out that there's entheogenic churches in the United States that use ayahuasca as sacraments, like very similar to ours now, And I took my trip to Florida. I had my first experience, and I never took another pharmaceutical again. Never again. I came home and I flushed 11 prescriptions down the toilet, and I just committed myself to the spiritual path. I started going back regularly, and it got to a point where I stopped sitting on the mat, and I started volunteering. And that led into me, being certified as an integration guide for psychedelics as a whole. I entered into a 1-year program, and talk about a blessing in disguise. COVID is the only reason I was able to do that. Like, we closed our office and we worked from home, and at that time I had enough residual income, like from sales and insurance. I didn't make another sale that entire year. I just dedicated myself to learning this new passion, and I kept involved with integrating for veterans and working with the Wellness Retreat Alliance out of Florida too. And, offering private retreats for veterans and things like that. And eventually that led me to meeting my wife, Raquel. she had started a community here in Houston, and when that travel started to become a burden for me, it was residual income, so it wasn't endless,
Yeah.
And then like right around October, it's really hard to sell home insurance, like because everyone's like back to school and the holidays, so there's not a lot of home sales. So that was my slow period, so I started feeling how expensive it was to fly back and forth to Florida. So I remember telling Justin, like, listen, I can't keep doing this. I need to find something closer to home. And he was like, well, why don't you reach out to our sister community in Houston? I was like, what the hell, Justin?
Why didn't you tell me that?
It's been a year, dude, that I've been coming back and forth, and like there's another community, and he was like, no, it's new, like it's been around for just several months.
Okay.
It's like, and they don't have an integration program, so maybe that's your in. So I was like, dude, this is perfect, So I end up, and I know we're going to dive deeper into this, so I won't go completely into the story just to save, for the conversation that we'll be having in the future. But nonetheless, it was just, it seemed like all of it just started building up to get me to where I am today, in front of a bunch of people who are just like me. Seeing the hope that there's a way to overcome their ailments and their limitations.
Amazing.
It's a common trend on this show, but it's another fantastic example of the darkest point in your life leading to the brightest moment in your life, right? And by you not shying away from the challenge, by you rising to the occasion, right? Hey, I'm experiencing these things. I need to do it better for myself, better for my son, better for my family. How do I do that? You found a way, and use it as a springboard for yourself and for your family to better others. It's a classic example on the show. We see it time and time again, and every time I'm blown away. Like the
adversity builds resiliency.
Yeah,
that's exactly
absolutely.
right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and once it happens, it all starts to make sense why you went through it in the first place. That's why, like, the majority of the conversation I have with the military or even first responders that come to us without hope is like, look, all of this is happening to build you up to something much greater in your life, so that you don't have a question, that you can handle what's in front of you, because you'll remember all the things that you've been through. So it's one of the hardest lessons to accept and to learn from, but nonetheless, if you can just get past this moment in your life, then you'll understand exactly why all of it was just planned perfectly to build your future, a brighter future.
Fantastic. Well, we appreciate you for sharing, man. I can't wait to dive into the next episode so we could hear more about this and the work that we could do to help our veterans and first responders.
Excellent.
Thanks for sharing your story today, Sergio, and thanks for joining us.
No, of course, it's been a pleasure, absolute pleasure, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
One last thing, where can we find you at?
Ooh, I'm all over the place. So we have a website for Agape. It's Agape, the number 4, smb.com. Our program, Agape Heroes, which services veterans and first responders, has a page on there as well. On social media, on Instagram, I go by Faith in Entheogens. And I have a TikTok for my music. I'm really, really involved for what I do. You can find my music at Sergio Saenz Music on TikTok and really all over the place. Awesome. And then we actually just started our podcast for Agape Heroes called the Heroes of Agape podcast.
Okay.
That's going to be featuring testimonials of people who go through our program, as well as people that are involved in supporting the program and bringing that into an awareness.
Fantastic.
So yeah, and like I said, I'm wherever you're at, I'm at. So feel free to reach out, and I'd love to hear from you guys.
Agape, Agape.
That's correct.
It means love. Right?
It's unconditional love.
Unconditional love.
Yeah.
Fantastic name.
Well, thank you very much, Sergio. We appreciate you, and we'll see you here shortly.
Yeah, thank you.
See you again.
All right.
Of course.
This has been the Medevac podcast, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please keep in mind, you got something out of this. I know you did. Share it, like it, engage with the video. Tell us who you want to see next, what topics you want us to cover, and we'll get back to you.
Until next time.
Bye.